The Oracle of Delphi was supposedly infallible, speaking directly for a god. Google is supposedly objective, just math, no opinions. Neither claim is fully true, and both institutions knew it. Yet billions of people, across thousands of years, kept coming back for answers anyway. This video is about why we need our uncertainty laundered through an authority, ancient or algorithmic. Picture this. You are responsible for answering every important question anyone in your community asks you. Should we go to war? Where should we settle? Will the harvest survive the winter? You have to answer instantly, and you have to be right often enough that people keep coming back instead of turning somewhere else. That is an impossible job for one person. And yet, for almost the entire span of human history, someone had to do it anyway. This is the real problem behind our story. Humans constantly face decisions that matter, without enough information to make them safely. War, trade, migration, survival. But true knowledge is slow to gather, hard to verify, and never evenly spread across a population. So every large society eventually builds the same kind of institution. Not a library, not a school, something closer to an answer machine. A place designed to take in questions faster than anyone could personally check the facts and hand back something confident enough to act on. This mattered enormously in the ancient world because a wrong decision at the wrong moment could end a kingdom. It still matters today for a different reason. We are not short on information anymore. We are drowning in it. So we still hand off the hard part, the judgment, to something we trust to sort it out for us. One king found out just how dangerous that trust could be. His name was Croesus, king of Lydia, and before he crossed a river into Persian territory, he wanted to know if it was a good idea. Croesus did not simply wonder about the future. He sent envoys to Delphi, the most trusted source of answers in the ancient Greek world, to ask whether he should attack the Persian Empire. To understand what happened next, you need to understand how Delphi actually worked, because it was far more organized than the image of a mystical woman mumbling in a cave. Anyone seeking an answer first had to purify themselves and make an offering, a payment known as the Polanos. Then came something easy to overlook but critical to how the system functioned. Priests questioned the petitioners. They screened who was asking, what they were really asking, and how the question should be framed. This was not a formality. It was quality control. Even the timing was managed. Priests poured cold water over a goat, and if the animal trembled, the day was considered acceptable for consultation. If it didn't, the petitioner waited. Only after all of this did the petitioner reach the Pythia, the priestess believed to speak for the god Apollo. She entered a trance-like state and spoke in a manner ancient sources describe as broken or difficult to understand. Priests then took her words and shaped them into verse, an answer official enough to carry back to a king. Here is the part historians rarely emphasize enough. Delphi's priests were not isolated in a mountain temple. They were plugged into a constant stream of information. Travelers came from across the Mediterranean, and priests questioned them about local politics, resource shortages, and military movements. Delphi functioned less like a fortune-telling booth and more like an intelligence hub, gathering real data long before a single trance ever began. So when Croesus asked whether he should cross the river and attack Persia, the answer he received was that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. He heard exactly what he wanted to hear. He crossed the river. He went to war. The empire that was destroyed was his own. Was the oracle wrong? Not technically. The prophecy was true. It was simply true in a way nobody bothered to question until it was too late. This is the real mechanism behind Delphi's power. The ambiguity was not a weakness in the system. It was the system. A vague answer can never be proven false. It can only be misunderstood, and the person who misunderstood it is the one who pays the price. That structure let Delphi remain the most trusted institution in the Greek world for nearly 1,000 years, never once forced to admit it was wrong. Centuries later, a different kind of institution would face the exact same underlying problem, at a scale no ancient priesthood could have imagined. By the late 1990s, the problem had changed shape, but not substance. There was no longer a shortage of information. There was an overwhelming, chaotic surplus of it, scattered across millions of newly created web pages, with no priest available to screen a single question. Two graduate students at Stanford, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, were trying to solve a version of the same challenge Delphi once solved. Not who deserves an answer, But which answer deserves to be trusted out of millions of competing possibilities? Their solution, described in a 1998 paper called The Anatomy of a Large-Scale Hypertextual Web Search Engine, was called PageRank. The core idea was borrowed from something far older than the internet, the way academic papers gain credibility through citations. If other respected papers cite your work is treated as more important. Page and Brin applied that same logic to the web. A link from one page to another was treated like a vote of confidence. But not all votes counted equally. A link from a page that was already considered important carried more weight than a link from an obscure, untrusted one. To make sense of this at the scale of the entire internet, they imagined something called the random surfer. A hypothetical user clicking links at random, forever. Pages that this imaginary surfer landed on more often, because more trusted pages pointed toward them, were ranked as more important. It was not a search for pure objective truth. It was a system for estimating trust, based on a web of relationships between sources, calculated automatically instead of through human interrogation. This is where the comparison becomes genuinely striking. Delphi had priests who personally decided how to interpret an ambiguous trance. Google replaced that human interpretation with mathematics, and it has kept refining that math for over 2 decades, layering in more signals, more factors, more complexity. But the basic output has never changed. You ask a question, and in less than a second, one confident answer rises to the top, while the actual reasoning behind why that specific page once stays largely hidden from you. Google does not put a robed priest between you and your answer. It does not need to. The ranking itself functions as the interpreter, deciding what counts as trustworthy before you ever see a result. And just like Delphi, the exact mechanics behind any single answer are not something an ordinary person can fully audit or challenge. Strip away the tripod, the goat, and the server farm, and you are left with the same underlying job, being performed by 2 radically different tools, 25 centuries apart. Strip both systems down to their working parts, and something becomes obvious. Delphi and Google are built from the same 3 layers. First, an intake layer. At Delphi, this was the priest screening who could ask a question and helping shape how it was phrased. For Google, this is the crawler, scanning and indexing the raw material of the web before any ranking ever happens. Second, an interpretation layer. Delphi's version was the Pythias trance, filtered through priests who turned confusion into verse. Google's version is PageRank and the layers of ranking signals built on top of it, turning a chaotic web of pages into a single ordered list. Third, a legitimacy layer. Delphi claimed its answers came from a god, which placed them beyond ordinary challenge. Google claims its answers come from neutral mathematics, which places them beyond ordinary suspicion. Neither claim is entirely accurate, and neither institution needed it to be. Both needed you to believe the process behind the answer was sound, even if you could never see the process yourself. That is the real product being sold in both cases. Not truth. A processed, ranked, authority-approved answer that feels objective, whether or not it fully is. The similarities go further than structure. Both systems scale trust through networks rather than direct verification. Delphi relied on city-states, sending official envoys and gifts, building a web of relationships across the Greek world. Google relies on links between websites, building a web of relationships across the internet. In both cases, being connected to already trusted sources is what earns you trust, not the raw truth of what you are saying. Both systems also depend on staying opaque. Nobody could look inside the Pythias trance and check her logic. Nobody outside Google can fully see why one page outranks another, since the exact formula is a closely guarded secret. That opacity is not an accident in either case. It is what protects the institution from being second-guessed into irrelevance. And both systems created entire economies built around gaining priority access. In ancient Greece, wealthy cities like Naxos received a privilege called promantia, the right to consult the oracle before ordinary petitioners. Today, an entire industry called search engine optimization exists purely to help websites rank higher, essentially competing for the modern equivalent of that same early access. But forcing every detail to match would be dishonest, so it is worth being direct about where the comparison breaks down. Delphi answered one question at a time, at enormous ceremonial and financial cost. available only a handful of days each year. Google answers billions of questions a day for free in a fraction of a second. That is not a difference in degree. That is a difference in kind. There is also a difference in the type of authority being claimed. Delphi's authority was religious and, by design, unfalsifiable. No one could disprove a god. Google's authority is framed as mathematical and, in principle, falsifiable, even though in practice almost no one has the access or expertise to actually check its work. One system was built to be unquestionable. The other is built to appear checkable, whether or not most people ever check it. So the connection here is not that these two systems work identically. It's that they were built to perform the same function, using completely different materials. And that points to something bigger than either Delphi or Google individually. Any society that grows too large and too complex for people to verify information for themselves ends up building the same kind of institution. Something that can process more information than any single person could, deliver that information with enough confidence to be usable, and quietly manage its own uncertainty well enough that people keep trusting it anyway. Seen this way, Google is not a strange, unprecedented invention of the modern world. It is the latest version of something humans have been building for thousands of years, in temples, in courts, in newsrooms, and now in server farms. Which means the real skill was never learning to distrust institutions altogether. Croesus did not fail because he trusted an answer. He failed because he never asked how that answer had been produced, who had shaped it, and what had been left ambiguous on purpose. That is a question just as relevant to a search result today as it was to a trance in a temple 25 centuries ago. So the next time you type a question into that search bar, you're not just running an algorithm. You're standing in the same spot as a petitioner outside Delphi, trusting a process you can't fully see, because the alternative is figuring it all out yourself. Which raises the question worth sitting with. As AI systems start answering instead of just ranking, collapsing that whole priestly translation layer into a single confident voice, are we building a more transparent oracle or a more convincing one? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one.